You may be seated. So I told you last week that this is John and Jane, or Juan and Jane, on our prayer list for 2.5 years, and they are now off the list. We are thankful for their time of struggle has ended, and they have a story to share with you. And it's an amazing story of trusting in God's love and knowing that God never lets go. Through the highs, through the lows, God never lets go. So I'm just going to hand it over to you guys for you to share with us.
Good afternoon, guys. The following we're about to share is our testament of loss and pain, but also of finding faith and a wonderful church family. It was at the worst time of our life that God spoke the loudest. 2.5 years ago, I was accused of a crime I did not commit and faced 33 years in state prison if convicted on all charges. It breaks your spirit. It leaves you powerless. Everyone you love suffers even more than you because all they can do is stand by and watch. But even then, God was with us. I was arrested on September 24th, 2014, and arraigned the next day, where my lawyer at the time entered a not guilty plea. I was then sent to Rikers Island until my family could come up with the bail money. My wife, my uncle, my mother, my mother-in-law, my niece pregnant at the time, and her fiance Louis rushed to the court to get the documents needed to get me out. My son Aaron, 8-year-old son Aaron, did not know where mom and dad were or why he could not come home anymore. For 5 days he worried, staying at different places under the care of my sister-in-law Carol, not knowing why this was happening to him. Meanwhile, in Rikers Island, the housing unit I was in was calm in the day and hell at night. A young Dominican I befriended told me he was beat up over his commissary. That's your snacks and your food. I was on the news, and the inmates there were curious about who I was. It was only a matter of time before I'd have to fight to protect myself. But God was with me. I was safe in a housing unit surrounded by bloods, but God protected me. The corrections officers were respectful and very professional, and even told me, fight the case. Once released, we headed to a family member's place. For the next 2.5 years, we used her living room as a bedroom and her sofa as a bed. We were very blessed, very fortunate that she lived 5 minutes away. She worked 2 jobs and gave all that she had to keep us together as a family. She tried her best to give Aaron a normal life. Come to think of it, a lot of friends and family believed in us and helped. By the time I made bail, I had been on the news for a week. The bail was at first $50,000 and then was raised by $200,000 more. I couldn't believe how many family members stepped up with collateral to post bond. Their sacrifice helped so much. See, I read an article once about prosecutors. They do something that's called bleed 'em and plead 'em, meaning that they know you can't afford the bail, so they keep you rotting in jail until, rotting in jail, and then they offer you a plea for a fraction of your sentence. Cases like mine had a high conviction rate because of these guilty pleas. But you know what? God protected us. Believe it or not, Google led us to this church. The worst thing that ever happened to me had now given me the opportunity to find God. At the time, my sister-in-law was going through a dark time herself, and so we attended the service together. I was a miserable wretch, but I found peace and happiness here. We all did. My 3rd time attending, I remember sitting in the pew by the glass stained window. That's my favorite seat right there. That's my seat. I'm sorry, got lost a little bit. When Pastor Raggie started the sermon by describing a trial, law and order, what a beginning to a sermon. You could hear a pin drop when this wonderful, wonderful woman spoke. You're accused of a crime. You had your trial, and now the jury deliberated. The verdict is in. The jury enters. You're anxious. You're nervous. Jurors, have you reached the verdict? Yes. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. My sister-in-law and I looked at each other almost in tears. Could she be talking about you? I don't think she wasn't. I think Pastor was describing the feeling one gets, the feeling of release one gets when God relieves us of our burden, the feeling of true freedom. I was able to experience both, so maybe in a way she was talking about me. My first impression of Tony, my attorney, was that he was detached and indifferent. He had little faith in God and seemed to care more about retainers and legal fees. Tony one day asked me to write my autobiography so he could get to know me better. I wrote it, dropped it off, and went to our house to continue our emergency move. There was a news photographer parked outside, and the media had reported from the front of our house. We could no longer afford to live there. The only thing sustaining us was Dana's part-time job at Home Depot. We didn't know how we were going to survive. In the middle of packing up the life we once knew into a moving truck, my attorney called. He called to say that he was moved by my life story and offered me a job as a paralegal. His kindness gave us so much hope. Standing there in the sunroom on the last day of my life as I knew it, in the place that we once called home, we hugged as a family, weeping and thanking God. Then I was arraigned a second time. The district attorney added more charges. How can they get away with lying? I didn't even recognize the names of some of my accusers. Over casual sips of coffee, Tony told me he wanted more money. Money we didn't have. My case was high profile in Brooklyn Supreme Court. Other attorneys either didn't have enough experience or they cared way too much about money. I felt lost without Tony, my attorney. So we prayed that God see into this man's heart, that he could see past the money and help us. He was already getting $90,000 to represent us. Everything else we had was tied up in bail. Days later, I felt that God touched his heart. He came over to me and said, I won't leave you, O. I won't abandon you. I'll do it for the $90,000. I ran over to hug him and thank him. As time passed, he would become a friend. Sometimes the kind of friend you want to punch, but a friend nonetheless. This man worked tirelessly preparing for trial. He barely slept. I worked with him, preparing opening and closing statements. We did legal research together. We looked over witness statements, and we looked through the evidence. We grew close at this time. In the middle of preparing one day, he stopped typing and looked at me. And on the outside, he looked the way I felt on the inside. He said, oh, I believe in you. As bad as you want to win this, I need to win this. I can't let an innocent man go to prison. Days became weeks, and time blurred into bouts of anxiety and depression. I barely slept. My poor Dana deteriorated physically and emotionally. I also noticed that through all this suffering, she was becoming more and more faithful as time went on. We brought home the church programs. We read the notes from pastor's sermons. We sang the songs. And every time she prayed, she saw a seagull. We felt peace only in church and during family get-togethers. It was so difficult to appear normal, hiding this secret from the world from fear of judgment. In the life, we smiled and joked. When no one watched, we cried. For 2.5 years. We found out one day that a year into the charges, one of my accusers was already suing me. No trial, no disposition, no plea, no end to the case. Did she really want justice? 2 of them, we found out, used the charges to get green cards, among other benefits from the government. Thinking about it now, I prayed and cried so much while parked outside the Coram post office. I walked in one day to mail a response to the civil suit. The postal employee who was processing the mail looked up at me and said, whatever it is you're going through, I hope it gets resolved. God is with you, like in the one set of footprints in sand. He doesn't just leave us in the valley of the shadow. He helps us walk through it. This is just a trial, You'll get through it. This man did not know me or my family. By then, I was old news in the media. He only looked at the envelopes and was moved to speak. He strengthened my faith. I felt like I was given a glass of water in the middle of the desert. My niece had a similar conversation with a lady at a bodega, and Dana with a person on the phone who was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Months then turned to years. People moved on with their lives, but we were still stuck in the same place. But a scene in the movie inspired us, and it said, even when God seemed to have abandoned us, he was watching. Even when he seemed indifferent to our suffering, he was watching. And when we were beyond all hope of saving, he gave us rest. Then he gave me a sign to continue our journey. Our journey of faith was a dark moment used for God's purpose, in his time and in his way. When we needed money to complete the legal fees, we were somehow approved for a loan, despite the fact that all I had was, at the time, income from a Home Depot part-time job and a credit score in the lower 600s. My niece and Dana tried to apply for loans themselves out of the goodness of their hearts to help. They also got denied, so we all had to co-sign. They co-signed my loan. Out of the blue, my old job called to tell me they owed me $2,000 for unpaid sick days. My retirement, I can't believe I still had retirement money left. My retirement was used to process the second bail. God provided. This wonderful church, every one of you sitting here, helped us without even knowing. Your smiles, your friendship, and your acceptance moved us. When we couldn't afford any food, your food pantry fed us. During hard times, you donated a Christmas tree and ornaments. You gave my son school supplies because we couldn't afford a backpack or notebooks. You taught him to believe in God. During the trial, he prayed every day that Dad could come home forever. He prayed that one day we could return to his house. He is prayerful and faithful because this church and the wonderful people in it taught him that. At the eve of trial, the DA decided to drop charges for 4 of my accusers and 13 counts in the indictment. It sounded like a blessing, but in reality, what she did was remove the ringleaders from the charges. One of those ringleaders even admitted to a teacher that she and other girls lied, plotted, and made up things to get me fired. The DA knew I was innocent, but she wanted to win. This was not about justice or truth. Mary Lou, a member of this church, Neil's wife, said that my attorney was once interrupted 35 times in one day while trying to defend me. Every objection against him was sustained. The 7 objections my attorney made against the prosecution were all overruled. He declared a mistrial over 6 times, but the judge kept on going. So on the first day of trial, the judge let it be known that she was going to seek the maximum sentence if I was found guilty. She then limited the defense. We could not call any witnesses to help us. Evidence in our favor was now inadmissible. A witness flew in from Washington State to speak on my behalf, and the judge refused to see her. We could not even mention the names of the ringleaders, except for one. Our whole defense was pulled out from under us. My lawyer, my defender, the man that I entrusted with my freedom, to fight for my freedom, our freedom, then vigorously convinced me to take a plea. At first he said it was 6 months in Rikers Island, but then they came back with 5 years plus register as a sex offender. From day one, the district attorney tried several offers. The devil tempts you. 30 days in jail, nothing else. How about no jail and just take a felony? Even my lawyer tried to convince me at the onset of trial. He and the people of his office believed in my innocence, but they admitted that they were scared, and in my shoes, they would have taken a plea. My attorney's reasoning was that a plea could save his innocent client from doing 10 to 35 years. He believed it was the type of case that jurors find it difficult to be fair in. He was an intense man, but now he was frantic. They gave me an hour to decide. I agreed to take the plea. My family sobbed as I pled guilty. The judge, for some reason, kept repeatedly asking me, Mr. Carrasquillo, is this really what you want to do? Is this really what you want to do? There's no coming back from this. I remember looking up above her head, and there's a sign, and it said, "In God we trust." My lawyer kept on whispering, "Do it, do it, sign it, do it." I was within an inch from signing the final document when nausea and anger overcame me. It shook my head, and I felt it, my heart speaking to me. And it said, no, no. I could not get up and admit to doing something I didn't do, especially disgusting allegations like the ones that were made against me. I looked at my family. It was like watching a funeral from the coffin. Between sobs, my wife said, "The truth will set you free." I turned and told the judge I would withdraw my plea. "Your Honor, I'm innocent. I'm not guilty, and I want to fight this." I wanted to say more, but my lawyer said shut up, so I had to shut up. I wanted to say a lot more to her. The night before I went on the stand, I prayed for protection, that God speak through me, that the district attorney's traps fall apart. My sister suggested that I read Psalm 35, and I did. Now, during direct examination, I felt no fear. I felt calm. The truth was on our side. I was able to be heard for the first time in 2.5 years, and I professed my innocence to the jury. Now, during cross-examination, all I could feel was anger at the district attorney. She knew I was innocent, but she wanted to put me away anyway, and I became combative. In the middle of the cross-examination of the suspect, the judge stopped everything and released us for lunch. Now, you guys watch Law and Order. You know that never happens. They don't even cut to commercial when like the lead suspect is testifying. It was then when Pastor, Mary Beth, Barbara, and Mary Lou prayed over me. We had lunch. We even laughed a little and came back. Louis, a very dear person to me, my niece's fiance, told me something I'll never forget then. I'm going to imitate, as I imitate his Bronx accent to get my testimony right. He said, "My man, you got the truth on your side. Just relax and answer her questions." You know, I felt a wave of relaxation come over me. I returned a different person. No matter how much that woman tried to trap me, the prosecution fell flat on her face. The lies were so great on the side of the prosecution that she based her evidence on incorrect photos. When my accusers and their parents took the witness stand, it was clear they were regurgitating rehearsed answers. One of them even admitted that she was told what to say by the district attorney and practiced with her over 7 times. There were way too many inconsistencies in their stories, especially on the cross-examination. Their parents, when they took the stand, admitted that I was respectable, and none of them believed their own children. Louis, my man Louis, later said to me, "I'm not very religious, but I felt the presence in that courtroom. I can't explain it, but there's been way too many coincidences in your case to make me think that what was going on really was a coincidence. I think what happened is that God was there. God was with us." The night before the verdict, I prayed. Now picture yourselves walking on a tightrope between 2 skyscrapers. How hard would you pray? That's how hard I was praying. That's how hard we were all praying. My sister told me that in her journey of faith, she prayed that God help her do what was needed to be released from her suffering. So that night I asked God if there was something that I hadn't done in this journey of faith, if there was something I had to let go of, if there's something else that I needed to do, to please tell me, please send me a sign and I'll do it. At 5 a.m. the next day, I woke up in a cold sweat. I dreamt I was in a dark room facing this large object. It spoke, but not through a voice, it spoke through my heart. And it said, faith, faith. All God wanted me to do was believe in him. You can pray and pray, you can sing the songs, but you have to believe that God is with you and God will answer. Just like the lady who touched the robe of Jesus, just like the time that Jesus calmed the storm. The day of the verdict. My niece, my mother, my wife, and my cousin sat lost in thought as I prayed by the window. I prayed for God's presence in the courtroom and in the jury room. I thanked him for that moment. I prayed for my family. And that morning, there was doubt in my head. And it was like a pull between the good and the bad. I actually remember Pastor Raggie bringing it up in one of the sermons, that inside us we have that pull, and you can go to one side, which is the bad, or you can go to God. And it was like a negotiation in my head. What about one count? What about one count and a year in Rikers? What about 2 counts, a year and a half in Rikers? You'll be out in 2/3 of the time. And anytime I heard that voice in my head, I would say, get away, Satan. My faith belongs to God. The verdict was in. 2 court officers stood close by, while 2 blocked the door. 3 others crowded the area I was supposed to sit in. It was very tense in the courtroom. I hugged my family goodbye, and I walked over to the defendant's desk. As I sat next to my lawyer, I said what may have been my final prayer as a free man. Lord, I give you my faith. My life is in your hands. The jury walked in with serious looks on their faces. There were 9 counts in my indictment. As each count was read, so was the verdict. The clerk spoke to the jury foreman. Has the jury come to a verdict? Yes. The foreman nodded. The clerk continued. In the first count of the indictment, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. It felt like a release. I pictured the day the allegations were made against me, but this time, the pain was flowing out in tears. In the second count, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. I remember Dana making her vows on our wedding day. Now we can grow old together. In the third count, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. I remembered the day that I came back from basic training and saw the pride in my mother's face. She will never have to live in shame. If you guys don't mind, I'll read this one little part in Spanish for my mother. En el tercer cargo, ¿cómo encuentran al defendente? No culpable. Me recordé del día en cual regresé del ejército y vi el orgullo en la cara de mi madre. Y ella siempre tendría su orgullo y no vivirá con tristeza. In the fourth count, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. I remember dinner at my sister's apartment in the Bronx when my nieces and nephew were little. In the fifth count, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. I remembered holding my niece's hand when she was 7. I'll get to hold it on her wedding day. In the sixth count, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. I saw the joyful look in my mother-in-law's face on our wedding day, and from now on she would have only tears of joy. In the seventh count, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. I pictured my sister-in-law Carol crying the first day we came to Holy Cross, and I'll always be there for her in pain and in joy. In the eighth count, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. I pictured the day my son Aaron was born. Now he'll always have a father by his side. And the ninth count, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. And I remembered something I always told Pastor Raggie. I saw myself in this church, which is just what I wanted, to be back in the church on Sunday, sitting at the pew closest to the stained glass window, with the sun at our back, and our hands in the air, praising God. All I could do was weep. God, our family, our faith, church set us free. I'm not the person I once was. None of us will ever be the same again. But I hope that as you heard this testament, you saw past all the horrible things and saw the way God's presence was felt. You see, God is everywhere if you look for him. You find God in watching praise signs, in parts of a movie, in song, in prayer. You can hear God speaking to you through others, in dreams and in your heart. You can see God in a sunny day when seagulls fly, or in a starry night. All you need is faith. Thank you.
There were only a few of us who knew the story in total, and we were doing some mighty praying, but some of you, after services, would come up. We prayed several times, I think twice, 3 times throughout the 2.5 years. You didn't know what you were praying for, but just asking for blessing for these two, and that's what this ministry is all about, and I wanted you to know this story of God's faithfulness, but more than that, their faithfulness to God. What I had said when the night before the verdict. Thank you. I'm very emotional about this. I said, you know, God didn't bring you this far with this many God moments to pull the rug out from underneath you. And, you know, we just knew that God was all over the place in this story for 2.5 years. And it's my privilege to know you. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I am better for having known you and gone through this together with you. So may God bless you and keep you. Now we're going to sing just a few verses of God Never Lets Go.